ongoing. That's nice.
Yeah. And,
Alhamdulillah.
you must be coming to the end of your. I know you weren't able to continue because of default madness. Is that coming to an end?
No.
No.
I still
The
have
madness
another
continues.
year. Yeah. October
Another year.
2022, inshallah, is my submission date.
Okay.
If all goes to plan.
Inshallah. By which time graduations may hopefully be happening properly on site.
Yeah, inshallah.
I think Oxford graduations this year, are they happening or are they delayed? Do you guys know what's happening in Oxford?
I'm not sure, actually. Do you know, Farabi?
No, I'm not sure. It doesn't affect me yet, but
you?
I'm not sure.
Yours a 4-year program, right, Farabi?
Yeah, 4 years.
So yeah, got another couple of years, inshallah. Cool. So should I load up my slides and then make a start, inshallah. Let me expand the slides out into a presentation and I'll share them accordingly.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay. You see that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So thank you, to all of you and Farabi, of course, for coaxing me into doing one of these sessions. But speaking about the Qur'an shouldn't require much in the way of coaxing, but my area of kind of expertise within the Qur'an is primarily qira'at and tajweed. So I always feel like a bit of a I feel like tafsir is not really my kind of particular. I've studied it, of course, but it's not really my particular area of specialty. But it's a fascinating area, and qira'at and tajweed, of course, are a part of tafsir. So it's important that I think I venture into that area every now and again, just to ensure that I'm staying in touch with my studies in tafsir. So Farabi, thank you for inviting me. Allah reward you for the invite. So my brief was to talk on this verse, so Ayah 41 of Surah Ankaboot. Ankaboot, as you know, translates as the spider, which is the name of the surah given on the basis of this verse in which the parable or the similitude is. The Quran, of course, as you know, is the wording of the surahs themselves that's revealed from Allah to the Prophet ﷺ through Jibreel, and that has been preserved, of course, since that time. The names of the surahs they were often given later as shorthand or the way of remembering particular surahs. Some surahs, of course, were named in the time of the Prophet ﷺ himself, and he would refer to them by such and such a name. Some were named in the earlier times, but they're not seen as divine in the same way that, of course, the verses and within the surah are, and the arrangement of the verses, etc. And sometimes the surah is named because of as we see here, because of a particular verse within the surah. Sometimes, like you see with Surah Al-Fatiha, it's again a name to denote the importance or the placement, or for example, of the surah. And some surahs have multiple names, you know. Surah Al-Fatiha is a good example of that. But Surah Al-Ankabut, so the spider, I thought we'd talk a little bit about the kind of the background of the surah itself before we come to the verse. Verse 41 itself. So it's a Makkan surah, probably an early Makkan surah, if you look at the verses within the surah itself. And as you know, the migration for the Muslims, the main migration that we're familiar with, of course, is the migration to Medina, which was 13 years after the revelation begins. But of course, as you know, there were also two earlier migrations during that period, two migrations to Habasha, what was then known as Abyssinia, now modern-day Ethiopia, to the land of Najashi, the king who was seen as a Christian ruler and seen as somebody who'd be more welcoming to, or certainly not persecuting the Muslims, as was happening in those very early days within Makkah. So this is the context that we find ourselves in within this surah, the persecution of the early Muslims. And that persecution is partly physical, and we know, the stories of people like Bilal anhu and Khabbab ibn al-Arat, for example, are very familiar to us. Khabbab was, like Bilal, was a slave. He was a blacksmith and known for his ability in that particular discipline. But because he was a slave and because he didn't have the kind of protection that people would have had in those early days, the earliest Muslims, like Abu Bakr, the Prophet himself, of course, they were kind of well connected, as it were. And in that tribal society, if you had that, even if you were espousing what was seen as radical views at the time, you had a degree of protection that these people who were seen as the kind of lower members of society wouldn't have. So Bilal, the suffering that he had at the hands of his master, not just his master, but also others from within the Quraysh, and similarly Khabbab ibn al-Arat, such that he lived, subhanAllah, he lived a long life. He lived through the Khulafa. He died in the Khilaf of Ali radiallahu anhu, and there is a narration from the time of Umar radiallahu anhu where he's, the people are moved by, I mean, it's in a conversation between him and Umar, and he reveals his back to show the scars that he had from these earlier stages when he was being punished for his early acceptance of Islam. He's probably amongst the first 10 people who accepted Islam. So there's this kind of physical persecution and torture that the Muslims were suffering, and emotional as well. So verse 8 in Surah Al-Ankabut and elsewhere as well, and you get similar verses in Surah Al-Isra and Surah Al-Luqman. These verses which you'll know about the injunction to the command to obey parents. So there was an interesting kind of dynamic where, and this verse is seen as having been narrated have been real, in the context of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, again an early Muslim, who was young at the time, probably kind of in his late teens, whose mother was, I mean, a very kind of smart emotional blackmail. She basically said to him, I'm not going to eat, I'm not going to drink, I'm not going to sit in the shade, I'm not going to protect myself from the sun until you disown Muhammad. And her rationale for that was, it's your book, it's your prophet, Muhammad, who commands you to obey parents. So by not listening to me, you'll be disobeying me. To be honest, you probably hear that in some cultural settings sadly nowadays as well, where people are told by their parents, you shall listen to me, because that's what the Quran and Sunnah say, regardless of what it is that they're saying, which of course is not at all what the Quran and Sunnah says. So this to the verse in Surah Ankaboot, verse 8. I'll read the translation. We have commanded people to be good to their parents, but do not obey them if they strive to make you serve beside me anything of which you have no knowledge. You would all return to me, and I shall inform you of what you have done. So the translation that I'll be using will be the translations from Abdul Halim, which is a fantastic kind of very comprehensible translation, although it doesn't necessarily stick very closely to the wording or the structuring of the verses, but it's a lot more comprehensible. So I'll be using that throughout as regards to the translations of the verses that we'll be considering. So yes, I mean, there's a command to be good. So ihsan or husn with parents, but then likewise not obeying them if they strive to make you serve. When jahadaka ala an tushrika bima laysa laka bihi ilm, anything of which you have no knowledge. So now that the message has come to you, now that you've accepted the message of Allah, the oneness of Allah and the Prophet as his messenger, then not to associate partners with Allah. So there's this kind of physical and emotional persecution and torture, and as I said, during this time, the Muslims are starting to probably think about hijrah. And Habasha, this first hijrah was in the there are different narrations, but probably within the first kind of 3 years of Islam. Some say 5, some say 3, and then the second one was about a year after that first one, when they come back to Makkah, and then they return with a larger cohort. So the first hijrah was about 15 people, very small, and the second hijrah was about 100 people, and then those people later returned to Medina. Some of them when the actual hijrah to Medina happened, some actually much later in the hijrah. Some actually stayed back in Abyssinia for some time. The interesting verse in Surah Ankaboot where Ibrahim alayhi salam is in a similar kind of situation. We'll touch upon this in terms of the context and the themes as well within the surah, where Ibrahim alayhi salam, as you know, he was forced to basically leave his land as well, kind of modern day Iraq, because his father, of course, was again well connected. So he was the king at the time was Nimrod, and again there's verses about the interactions with Ibrahim alayhi salam and the king of the time, and of course with his father as well, Azar. And his father Azar was a well-known maker of idols, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, story of Ibrahim alayhi salam and the idols. But because of what happens, because of breaking the idols, because of his facing the king and not going along with what the king wanted to go along with, and the king of course saw himself as sovereign, much like Fir'aun did, and Fir'aun of course mentioned in this surah as well. So ultimately he's kind of consigned to the fire, Ibrahim alayhi salam. Again, you know what happens with that, and he eventually, and in this surah he says, وَقَالَ إِنِّي مُهَاجِرٌ إِلَىٰ رَبِّي, I'm migrating for the sake of or towards my Lord, meaning I'm leaving this land. And again, so this in the same way that Ibrahim alayhi salam is forced to leave his land, this surah is revealed at a time when the Muslims are coming to the point where they too will likely be having to leave their land. Which, I mean, I guess if any of you who kind of migrated for other reasons, whether for kind of economic reasons or reasons of study, it's challenging. But you're generally coming towards something which is probably you're coming. I mean, of course, for refugees, I mean, this is something which is which will be something which will be much more familiar. And sadly, we're seeing that a lot in the world at the moment, given kind of the various things that are happening in the world. But to leave something which had been your home for forever, as it was for the Meccans at the time, and the Prophet says, as you're leaving it, we're not for your people. As addressing Mecca, would never have left. And so you can imagine the kind of turmoil that people are feeling, but also the fact that they're leaving for something which they hope will be better. But again, there's that massive unknown of whether it's going to Medina, whether it's going to Habasha, they're going to Abyssinia. So there's this idea of preparing for hijrah within the surah as well. And then the surah moves on to the lessons from the prophets. So then we come to kind of centuries of examples of, and with Nuh alayhi salam, of course, literally a century. I mean, وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا نُوحًا إِلَىٰ قَوْمِهِ فَلَبِثَ فِيهِمْ أَلْفَ سَنَةٍ إِلَّا خَمْسِينَ عَامًا. We sent Nuh to his people. فَلَبِثَ فِيهِمْ أَلْفَ سَنَةٍ. So he remained amongst them for 10,000 bar 50 years, so 950 years. And that staying amongst them, generally, the Mufassirun feel that is his time of preaching. So of course there's a time before that, there's some time after that as well. But and again, this is a reminder to the early Muslims. And we also see as an example of, again, Khubayb al-Arat, he comes to the Prophet ﷺ when he's suffering what he's suffering. And he says to the Prophet ﷺ, will you not seek Allah's help for us? Will you not call upon Allah for us? And the Prophet ﷺ responds, by basically reminding them again of, just like the surah does here, of the people of the past and the punishments that they had suffered. Surah Ankaboot starts in a very similar vein. Do people reckon, is it their calculation that they'll be left to their devices, but after they've said amanna, we've believed, and they will not be tested? Fitna, or this word yuftan, to be tested, to be put to the trial. The original meaning of this linguistically is the kind of the separation of gold, heating or melting of gold to separate it from its impurities. And so in a sense, you can see the kind of the value of what comes through. Clearly it's a challenging and difficult process for the Sahaba who are going through it, but these were the best of people for that very reason, because of the trials that they and tribulations that they suffered. So Nuh alayhi salam, he's preaching for 950 years, so it's this centuries of preaching. Ibrahim alayhi salam, again, his story comes in the Qur'an multiple times, but again in this surah as well, as we just mentioned. And then there are the stories of Lut, the stories of Shu'aib, briefly. The people of Ad and Thamud are mentioned briefly. So the Qawm Hud and Qawm Salih, that's mentioned in a single verse in this surah as well. And then, of course, the lesson from the tyrants of the past as well. So all of Qarun and Fir'aun and Haman. Qarun, of course, was a wealthy, arrogant man from amongst the people of Musa alayhi salam. Fir'aun, of course, you all know, and Haman was a minister from of the Pharaoh of Fir'aun. And their examples are mentioned in this surah as well. And then after this, we come to the verse, which is the verse that we'll be considering today. So I thought it'd be helpful to recite the verse. I'll put it both on the right in the Uthmani script, the kind of the Arab script, and the script you'd be familiar with if you use those kind of Uthmani Masahif, which are common in most of the Arab world. And on the left is the Indo-Pak, the subcontinent script, or the kind of Urdu script, which most people who've learned to read the Quran in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., will be more familiar with. So we'll recite the verse. I'll point out some subtle differences in terms of the different readings of the Quran, but they are very subtle in this verse. And then we'll move on to consider the verse in a bit more detail, inshallah. So I was going to try and finish by 10:30. I understand we've got 30 to 45 minutes, but I don't want to talk at you for all 45 minutes. So I hope we can discuss as we either go along. So please do come in if you'd like to comment or anything, or at the end as well, inshallah. If anybody's got any queries or any kind of comments or thoughts on what we've discussed today. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم مثل الذين اتخذوا من دون الله أولياء كمثل العنكبوت اتخذت بيتا وإن أوهن البيوت لبيت العنكبوت لو كانوا يعلمون. So the verse, you can see the translation again, that's Abdul Halim's translation there. Those who take protectors other than God can be compared to spiders building themselves houses. The spiders is the frailest of all houses, if only they could understand. So the variant readings are there's only a couple of things. So the length of the mud and awliya, there are different lengths of that. So some lengthen it kind of an intermediate length, some lengthen it slightly longer. And the only other difference is in the word buyut. So this is a linguistic difference in Arabic language as well. So buyut is sometimes read biyut with a kasra. So awhan al-biyuti rather than awhan al-buyuti. And that's probably because of the proximity to the ya. And the ya, as you'll know, is has an association with the kasra. For example, it's the vowel that's used to lengthen the kasra. So in terms of takhfif or facilitation of reading or speaking Arabic, sometimes you'll get this where you've got a ya in proximity, then the haraka, the vowel, will change to a kasra. So like I said, so just a few differences. We'll see this, if only they could understand, we'll see it appearing again later in the surah as well. I'll touch upon that in just a minute. Right, sorry about me. Just translations. So the word awliya. So this is, as we saw in the previous verse, if you can see my mouse moving, but awliya comes in this verse. And awliya is a plural of the word wali. So wali has numerous meanings. So I mean, it's a word that you may well have come across in your own languages as well. So it's used beyond the Arabic language. It's used in, I'll give a number of dictionary meanings or dictionary definitions in just a minute, but also it's used within particular disciplines. So in Tazkiyah or Tasawwuf, for example, wali has a very particular meaning, and therefore you'll see it's commonly used kind of Persian or now Urdu as well, almost translation. So the idea of a bead. We could talk a little bit about that perhaps now, perhaps in the discussion as well. So what are the meanings? Except the numerous: a confidant, an ally, a friend, a helper, a guardian, a master, a supporter, a protector, an heir, i.e. the guardian of one's blood, for example, and interdisciplinary. So the idea of a saint as a wali as well. In Surah Al-Baqarah, so those are kind of dictionary definitions, but I thought it'd be helpful. Often is when we're doing tafsir of the Quran, it's helpful to do tafsir of the Quran with Quran. So the word wali comes in numerous forms, kind of numerous words that you derive from those root letters of waw, lam, and ya. So mawla, for example, awliya, which is a plural, of course, as we said, is wali of wali. Tawalla, so verb forms of waliya, those three root letters. In Surah Al-Baqarah, so again, really well-known verses. In verse 257, Allahu waliyyu alladhina amanu. But prior to that, as the well-known verse, La ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion. And there's different understandings as to what that means, La ikraha fi din, and again, you find that in the tafsir. But the verse, again, I'll read the translation, continues. So verse 256 in Surah Al-Baqarah continues. So there is no compulsion in religion. Again, this translation of Abdul Halim. True guidance has become distinct from error. قد تبين الرشد من الغي فمن يكفر بالطاغوت ويؤمن بالله فقد استمسك بالعروة الوثقى. So whoever rejects false gods and believes in God, in Allah, has grasped the firmest handhold, one that will never break. God is all hearing and all knowing. And the following verse 257, which is cited here, God is the ally of those who believe. Allahu waliyyu alladhina amanu. Here Abdul Halim translates it as ally. And what does that mean? What does it mean to be a wali of those who believe? He brings them out of the depth of darkness and into light. يخرجهم من الظلمات إلى النور. والذين كفروا awliya. As for those who disbelieve, again, so the word awliya here, their allies are false gods who take them from the light into the depths of darkness. They are the inhabitants of the fire, and there they will remain. So this awliya in Surah Al-Baqarah, we see it again in this verse, those who take protectors other than God. There's a similar use of the word awliya in Surah Yunus, verse 62 and 63. Ala inna awliya Allahi la khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzanun. It's a translation, but for those who are on God's side, this Abdul Halim translates here as on God's side, there is no fear, nor shall they grieve. For those who believe, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَكَانُوا يَتَّقُونَ. So what does it mean? What does it mean to be on God's side or to be a wali Allah? الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, those who believe, وَكَانُوا يَتَّقُونَ. So this is almost kind of a level beyond just belief alone. وَكَانُوا يَتَّقُونَ, and they have taqwa, they are God conscious. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah has a book, Al-Furqan bayn awliya ar-Rahman wa awliya shaytan. So the kind of the separating or the criteria between awliya ar-Rahman and awliya, how we translate it. So the friends of Allah and the friends of shaitan. And within that, the definition of pride of wilaya. So wilaya should have said so wilaya or walaya with the fatha or kasra is the masdar or the verbal noun of drawn from these root letters waw, lam, and ya. And wilaya is drawn from love, habba, and proximity, qurb, whereas its opposite, adawa, is drawn from hatred, bughd, and distance, bu'd. So again, this is just to give you a feel for what we mean by wali, and it's plural awliya. So one can just be a wali of Allah, and Allah is his wali, that the wali of that person, and we hear this in waliyullah, it's often used as a title or a name for some people. But as in verse 41, we're seeing awliya being used in a negative sense. And actually in the Quran, again, waliya or its derivatives appear about 90 times. And about 2/3 of those are relating to being a wali of Allah, or taking Allah as a wali. And the other third approximately are taking other than Allah as a wali, as in this example that we see in verse 41, those taking protectors other than God and how they're compared. So we'll come to that similitude, that parable, in just a minute. Before that, just an example from the hadith of the use of wali. So again, the well-known hadith Qudsi. So hadith Qudsi, is where the Prophet narrates from Allah. It's different from the Quran in the sense that hadith Qudsi, like any other hadith, has to be judged according to the criteria by which a hadith is judged. For example, it's is its chain well connected? What's the criteria that we normally judge the narrators according to? Are they well-established narrators? Are they good in their memory or good in their kind of preservation of the hadith through writing, for example? Is the hadith free of any kind of defects that an expert might be able to recognize? Is the hadith free of any kind of contradicting hadith which are similar but different and coming from a stronger narrator? So it's kind of a standard criteria by which we judge the strength of a hadith or the authenticity of a hadith. A hadith Qudsi is not like Qur'an in that sense, because the Qur'an doesn't require this criteria because it's so well established from the earliest generation that we don't need those criteria to establish its authenticity because of the nature of Qur'an itself. I mean, there's the divine preservation, of course, but even from a purely academic sense, the Qur'an has been recited and taught by so many people at every single level since the time of the Prophet ﷺ, that it has that idea of it's discussed in kind of Islamic sciences, the idea of tawatur, but that being a condition of. There's some controversy around that, so I won't go into it, but you'll see it in kind of beginner texts in Quran and Tajweed that for something to be given a degree of, for something to have authenticity, one of those conditions is that it have this idea of tawatur. The idea of tawatur itself was something which was established kind of later on by later scholars and academics within the Islamic tradition. Sorry, slight tangent there. So Hadith Qudsi would not have those. It's not Quran in that sense. It's not revealed in the same way as Quran. It's not recited in the Salah like the Quran. I mean, so you couldn't recite this, for example, in the prayer. So it's different to Quran, but it's still Allah said, as we see in this hadith. So the Prophet ﷺ, and this is from Sahih Bukhari. So of course, it's a well authenticated hadith. Allah's Messenger said that Allah said, I will declare war against him who shows hostility to a pious worshipper of mine. You can see yet another translation of wali. Wali is translated here as a pious worshipper. And the most beloved things with which my slave comes nearer to me is what I have enjoined upon him. And my slave keeps on coming closer to me through performing nawafil, kind of voluntary acts, till I love him. So I become his sense of hearing with which he hears, and his sense of sight with which he sees, and his hand with which he grips, and his leg with which he walks. And if he asks me, I will give him. We see a similar kind of in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ, this proximity of Allah to his slave. And if he asks my protection or refuge, I will protect him, I will give him refuge. And I do not hesitate to do anything as I hesitate to take the soul of the believer, for he hates death and I hate to disappoint him. So you can see this, again, the idea of a wali and his proximity to Allah. مَنْ عَادَى لِي وَلِيًّا فَقَدْ آذَنْتُهُ بِالْحَرْبِ. And Allah has declared war upon that person who shows hostility to a wali of Allah. So again, a way to understand the word wali. So we've seen those taking protected other than God, and now they're compared to this spider, just spiders building themselves houses. كمثل العنكبوت اتخذت بيتا. Not just compared to a spider, but compared to a spider building a house. And a spider building his house, of course, I mean, its house we generally translate it into English as its web. Bait in Arabic is it's usually associated with a degree of permanence and protection. So the verb bati yabitu is often translated as to remain, or he spent the night somewhere, or stayed the night somewhere, or spent the night doing something. So it's used in that context in the Arabic language. And the word bait, of course, comes from that. So it's associated with something which will at least allow you to spend the night in there. And a spider web, of course, doesn't have that degree of permanence associated with it necessarily. A web is transient, so like this world. So in the statement in Surah Ankaboot, in so verse 64, وَمَا هَذِهِ الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا لَهْوٌ وَلَعِبٌ. So the translation is as follows: the life in this world is merely an amusement and a diversion. The true life is in the hereafter. If only they knew. If only they knew. لَوْ كَانُوا يَعْلَمُونَ. If only they could understand. It's translated as here. So we see the same theme repeating itself later on in the surah. That the world itself is transient, just like this web. Having said that, as if any of you, as we were discussing when we first started the session, it's also incredibly strong. I mean, if we think of the spider's web, its tensile strength is more than that of steel, yet it's more elastic. And Farabi, correct me if any of this is inaccurate, but tensile strength, I think, is the kind of stress you can apply to something before it breaks, the load that you can apply to it. And elasticity, I think, is the degree to which a material can take a force and not be distorted or return to kind of its original form. So it's an incredibly strong material, yet elastic. But despite that, I mean, the perception, that's kind of from a purely scientific perspective, but the perception of the spider's web, of course, is that it is very transient. And on my last slide after this one, I'll show you some Fakhruddin Razi in his tafsir also touches upon this idea as well about the transience of the spider's web. So that strength appears to be quite fleeting and quite frail. In contrast, actually, to we mentioned Ad and Thamud in who also mentioned in the verses just prior to verse 38, just prior in Surah Ankaboot, وَعَادًا وَثَمُودَ وَقَدْ تَبَيَّنَ لَكُم مِّن مَّسَاكِنِهِم, and Ad and Thamud and their dwellings have been made apparent to you. So their dwellings, of course, have that degree of permanence. You know, they're building in Ad in Hadramaut, southern Arabia, Thamud in northern Arabia, and kind of modern day Saudi Arabia. Those dwellings are still present, or certainly they were present at the time. And the Arabs, as you know, they would travel. They would travel north and south from the Hijaz as part of their trade caravans, and they would see these dwellings as a remembrance of the people who had come before them. And despite those centuries of rule and tradition and tyranny in the case of Qarun and Fir'aun, etc., despite all of that, little of what they had achieved remains. So those, and again, this brings us back to these awliya that they were taking other than Allah. And those awliya, not only is there little of them remaining per the spider's web, but actually beyond that as well, and this is early in the surah, we see Ibrahim alayhi salam saying to his people, إِنَّمَا تَعْبُدُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ أَوْثَانًا وَتَخْلُقُونَ إِفْكًا. Again, I'll give you the translation of the bit that just follows that. You have chosen idols instead of God, but your love for them will only last for the present life. Again, it's transient. On the day of resurrection, you will disown and reject one another. So you'll curse each other, you'll disown one another, you'll disbelieve in one another. So not only is it transient in this world, but actually the taking awliya other than Allah will have a degree of permanence, but not where you wanted it to have that degree of permanence. Rather in the hereafter, where you'll be disowned by those very same protectors, where they can offer you none of that protection that they may have in the world itself. So Bait, again, I'll come to the last slide with from the tafsir of Imam Razi. But Bait, like I said, in the Arabic language, it has numerous uses, and it can be used for. It's interesting in the sense that, again, the Arabs, of course, were often a nomadic people, so they may not have a bait, again, about this idea of kind of staying the night, for example. It gives it a degree of permanence, so a clay or a structure which is made of something a bit more permanent, unlike the kind of akhbiya or the khibat, the kind of a tent that would be more common in the where they're made of hair or wool or whatever it might be. So the Arabs, I mean, as any language, they've got numerous names for the different kinds of. So, for example, bijad for something which is made out of wabar, kind of soft hair, or a khibat, a tent or a khayma, again a tent which has got a kind of a pole to give it a degree of permanence, or bait or dar, an abode. So all of these terms are used in the language, but here in the Qur'an, the word bait is used, and we'll come to this in our last slide. So Fakhruddin Razi, not to be mistaken by Muhammad ibn Zakaria Razi, who was an earlier, like many scholars in their time, kind of polymath. So Fakhruddin Razi, he died in 606 Hijri, and Abu Bakr Razi dies in around about 300 years earlier, so about 313 or thereabouts. Both in, or I'm going to say modern day or was Persia scholars. So he's got a tafsir Kabir Mafatih al-Ghaib, which is a huge work of, I think, about 32 volumes. So it's a good tafsir to dip into if you want to kind of explore a little bit more about particular verses. And sometimes you get a bit lost in his various kind of examples that he gives, where the original meaning of the verse can be lost. So it's interesting, and it can give a verse a bit more depth. So I've drawn a little bit from there in terms of why he feels the spider's web has been used as an example of taking other than Allah as awliya. So he mentioned that it barely meets the requirements of a house. A house has a wall for protection, a roof for shade, a door to close, for warmth and privacy, etc. But a spider web provides very few of those benefits. It's the web, like a wali provides very little in the way of benefits. The wali in other than Allah. It's the web. So this is an example. So it's the web as a bait. It's the web as a house in the parable, not the web itself. Because the web, of course, does confer some benefit for the spider. The spider can use it for for its hunt. I mean, not all. I think wolf spiders, for example, I think they run down their prey, but some spiders, most I don't know, many spiders use the web as a source of trapping their prey. So it clearly has some benefit for the spider. But were the spider to give this web the permanence of a bait, that would be akin to taking awliya other than Allah. So that's another example that Razi provides. A gust of wind, he says, leaves no trace of the actions of the spider. Likewise, the actions of awliya for the awliya other than Allah. What we do in this life, it has that impermanence. And the only trace, unfortunately, that it leaves is what we saw Ibrahim a.s. telling his people that they will see the harms of those awliya in the hereafter, but in this life, it leaves barely anything. And finally, he says that this verse also warns against the riya being the kind of a shirk al-khafi, the lesser shirk, where to do something for a wali, and this is again, we mentioned kind of this idea of the pir or the wali as a saint, and of course this has there's weight to this tradition in the Islamic in the Islamic tradition, but we sometimes also see, unfortunately, this idea of the wali or the pir being used inappropriately, where people do things for the sake of a wali, or the wali kind of takes over a person's life in a way which is really inappropriate, and particularly given the nature of Islam and the direct connection that a Muslim is encouraged to have to Allah and the Messenger and the scholarly tradition. So the verse Razi says also warns against riya, in that to do something for a wali rather than doing something for Allah's sake alone is again that kind of stupidity of or the foolishness of a spider making its web. I mean, use the web for what it's meant to be, i.e. for food, etc. Don't see it as something which has the permanence of a bait. So likewise, make use of the wali in this life. So the friend, the protector, the guardian, the ally, of course they have a role to play in this life, but then to take them as something beyond that, to start seeing them as deities, as Fir'aun asked that he be seen, for example, and to a lesser degree that we see of people kind of following their desires or following things in a way that one should have that kind of sincerity and that kind of love for Allah alone. We said wilaya earlier, that translation that Ibn Taymiyyah provided was this qurb and mahabba, this kind of proximity and love, and one should ensure that degree of proximity and love primarily is for Allah alone. Of course, we'll have lesser degrees of that for others, but whatever we're doing ultimately should be for Allah's sake. So I think that's all I've got. Let me stop sharing, and I've got a little bit beyond 7, sorry, but hand over to you if there's any kind of queries or questions or comments on the verse itself or thoughts.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair for the talk, Ustad. If you don't mind, would you be able to recite just a few more ayat in a different qira'ah, just around that passage?
I can do. I mean, bear with me. Let me bring it up. Well, I mean, I was gonna, if there's something in the chat as well. I could do that. For those of you who are on tomorrow, I'll be reciting in a different reading tomorrow. I'm happy to. I thought it might be helpful just in the last few minutes that we've got, just to say something else about recitation generally in Ramadan.
It's up to you, to be honest.
Yeah.
Whatever you think would be more beneficial, up to you.
I mean, there's obviously benefit in reciting Qur'an, and I did want to say something about that, because on our third slide, when we were reciting the verse, there's benefit to be had, of course, in reciting verses. So it's something to encourage. I'm sure you guys are doing it already, but in the last few days of Ramadan, of course, to ensure that you're bring up the last slide for a second. It's quite boring. Let me share the screen and then talk. Right, third slide. So the third slide where I had the that's the last slide, Ibrahim. But Ibrahim, if you look at Tafsir Razi, it's provided in a bit more detail there as well. So yeah, sorry. So so reciting verses and listening to verses. I just want to touch upon that in our last few minutes. But recitation-wise, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to take away too much of your time, because I want to encourage you guys to recite yourselves and listen to recitation as well, which of course what Frail is asking me to do. But recitation in the Quran, I'm sure you guys all in Ramadan, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with the benefits of that, of course. Listening to Quran as well is something which I think we do, but it's something we should also do with the understanding that this is also well established. Also, I mean, there's a good example of that from the hadith, from the tradition. So there's a really lovely narration in the Sahih Imam Bukhari, and Imam Bukhari brings it in as often his way. He brings it in numerous chapters in his Sahih, in his collection of hadith. So he has the the hadith is narrated by Abdullah bin Mas'ud, and it's a dialogue. It's a very lovely dialogue between Abdullah bin Mas'ud and the Prophet ﷺ. And Abdullah bin Mas'ud, again, as you know, is a Sahabi who's well known, well versed, well known for his knowledge of the Qur'an. So the Prophet ﷺ says to him, "Iqra alayya al-Qur'an." So he says to Abdullah bin Mas'ud, recite the Qur'an to me, recite kind of upon me, recite for me. And Abdullah bin Mas'ud is slightly taken aback because, and he says, I mean, so you can see from what he says, he's slightly taken aback. He says, "Aqra'u alayka wa alayka unzil." Should I recite the Qur'an to you, yet it's been revealed to you? And the Prophet ﷺ said, again, he responds to Abdullah bin Mas'ud and says, "Inni uhibbu an asma'ahu min ghayri." Is it beloved to me, or I love that I hear it from other than myself? So Abdullah bin Mas'ud, he starts reciting Surah An-Nisa, and he comes to the verse, فَكَيْفَ إِذَا جِئْنَا مِنْ كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ بِشَهِيدٍ وَجِئْنَا بِكَ عَلَى هَؤُلَاءِ شَهِيدًا. So how will it be? It's basically painting a scene on the Day of Judgment, when the Prophet is brought forth as a witness for or against his people, and the Prophet he says, "Hasbuk, enough, stop there." And Abdullah bin Mas'ud, again, he's narrating, so he says, and I turned to the Prophet I turned towards him, and I saw his eyes flowing with tears. So there's, like Imam Bukhari brings this hadith in numerous chapters for kind of numerous benefits. I mean, we want to mention it here just because for a few things. One, the effect of the Quran. I mean, no one, of course, would recognize the value of the Quran more than the Prophet ﷺ, and the effect of the Quran upon the Prophet ﷺ, that it moved him, and of course the Sahaba and generations after them as well, to tears. So to listen, I guess one of the issues, of course, at the moment, and the reason I'm mentioning it here is about listening, because we listen sometimes without that ability, unfortunately, sometimes to understand, but also without taking the time to understand and reflect. So being moved to, I mean, you'll find people being moved to tears just by dint of the fact that they're listening to something which is divine, even without understanding, which is, of course, the power of the Quran itself. As we were saying right at the very beginning, that's a kind of a secondary or tertiary aspect of the Quran. I mean, the primary aspect of the Quran is that it's a book of guidance, and that guidance only comes through understanding and reflection. Of course, Allah guides who He wills. It can come however He wills. But a part of that, of course, is true, and this is again a command of the Quran itself. To contemplate, to think about the Quran, and to do that, one of course needs to. Again, one can contemplate just upon the divinity of it without understanding it, and there are some would argue that there are some hadith which support that as well. But ultimately, it's about understanding the Quran and reflecting upon it in the way that the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba did. So there's that. But also doing that when one is reading, which is of course how we primarily do it. So I'll just stop sharing. Whilst one is reading, and then so the encouragement again, if you're reciting the Quran, try and take some time to recite with translation as well, and if possible with tafsir. But to be honest, the translation often is enough, because the translation, of course, is tafsir in its own right. I mean, any translation is never going to be a Quran, so it's already doing a bit of tafsir when it's translating. So that will allow you to cover more of the Quran and to reflect by yourselves. I mean, the tafsir, of course, are reflections of scholarly and learned people. But we all, I mean, Allah has granted us all the ability to reflect. You may find in some traditions, some cultures, that were kind of warned against reflecting upon the Quran because it's dangerous, or may take you away from the Quran. But I mean, the Quran was revealed to all mankind. Now, of course, that's not to say not to one should do everything by themselves and not rely upon the centuries of scholarship and tradition that we have. Of course, absolutely rely upon that, and particularly if it's something which is difficult to understand. But the Quran it had been revealed. I mean, the verse وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. We've made the Quran easy as a form of remembrance. Of course, there's different ways of understanding that. فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. So is there anyone who will take that remembrance, will take that admonition. But part of that, of course, is trying to understand the Quran, trying to reflect upon the Quran through reading. And the benefit of reading, of course, is that you're using your eyes. If you're reading from the Mus'haf, you're using your hands, and all of those things which may act as witnesses for or against is clearly mentioned in the Quran. To the point of our skin as well will bear witness for or against us on the Day of Judgment. We want everything possible on that day. When people are trying to flee from the most beloved people, and as we saw in the earlier verses, when the awliya, those who are awliya other than Allah, are bearing witness against those who they protected in this life. On that day, to have the Qur'an, to have everything possible bearing witness for us, and of course the Qur'an likewise. Part of that comes through reading and with the mushaf and looking and reading, etc. But part of it, of course, also comes through listening. And of course, when reading, you will be listening yourself, but listening to others recite the book, because that, as we saw in the hadith, it allows one to reflect upon the Qur'an in a way that reading itself doesn't. Because again, when you're reading, you're engaging other aspects of your cognitive function, which means that you're not able to listen and reflect in quite the same way that you would if you're listening alone. So just encouragement, really. Sorry, coming to the end of the last minute. To take time to, in addition to reading with translation or with kind of tafasir or mini tafsir, also taking time to listen, and with that listening, reflection, but also again with whatever you're listening to, try to understand it in the context and I mean the verses themselves in terms of the translation of what it is that you're listening to. And likewise, of course, in tarawih, in the prayer, try and to whatever extent you can understand. For example, if you know what's being recited, just read it before you're coming in so that you can appreciate it whilst it's being recited in the tarawih. Yeah, sorry, like I said, I think that the recitation, we'll do that tomorrow in Tarawih, inshallah. There are readings of the variant readings in the Quran, of course, dotted across the internet. And I think if you guys would like to, we could certainly do sessions where we just get together and recite in the different readings. Very happy to do that as a kind of a separate thing. But I just wanted to get that message about reading, reciting with reflection and understanding through as well before we finish up today.
Yeah, no, jazakallah khair. If anyone has any questions, then feel free to send them. But we are like essentially at the end of the time allocated.
That's strategic talking at you, so I didn't have any time to answer questions.
No, it's okay. Alhamdulillah.
If anybody have any queries or comments, of course, please do kind of email me or just pass them to Farad, inshallah.
Yeah.
I hope that was awesome help, inshallah. And yeah, so yeah, whoever's able to make it tomorrow, inshallah, look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Tarawih, inshallah, yeah.
Inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, Ustadh.
Barakallahu feekum. Thank you for inviting me again.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Assalamu alaikum.